point in time, I want to shift the discussion to cult identities, the characteristics of cult identities. In your book, you mention here from Chapter 8, the warrior-soldier mentality is another essential part of most cult identities. In a destructive cult, the soldier mentality is made to believe, I must follow orders from my superiors, we are good, our enemy is bad. Sacrifice for the greater good makes you a hero. Are there other aspects that you have found in members or former members of destructive cults that you'd like to mention?
Well, there's usually a sense of urgency that if we don't fight, if we don't do what we need to do, there'll be terrible, dire consequences. And right now, in 2011, it's a month past the devastating earthquakes and tsunami wave and nuclear plant meltdown. And a lot of apocalyptic cults are just having a field day, just saying, wow, this is proof that you need to follow God the way we say, or else. Or, it's just absolutely proof that you need to drop out of college and donate your car and your bank account and your house to us because the world's going to come to an end. And I say to myself, oh my goodness, people are being so paralyzed with fear. In most cases, people who are having this manipulation and fear inculcation are nowhere near Japan, are not in danger. But because of mass media and the internet, we can watch this imagery of the tsunami wave and such, and we can empathize and imagine being there, and we can be traumatized by media. And I just am really, really concerned that because fear sells media, and because fear sells recruitment into black and white, us versus them, good versus evil, to get back to your initial question, kind of mentality, a lot of people are being recruited into situations they're going to regret for a really long time.
I want to read another quote from your book. This is from the same chapter, Chapter 8, Interacting with Dual Identities. When the cult identity takes over, a person's past is redefined and often distorted. Would you care to comment on that?
Sure. So in all the different models that I've studied of mind control and brainwashing, the creation of a cult identity that suppresses the person's real identity seems to ring most true. And I've heard from thousands and thousands of people at this point, from many, many different groups. I'd say probably at least over 1,000 groups, if not more. They say, yeah, that was what it was like. It was like two of me. And what's tricky is that if you talk to someone who's a cult member, they really believe that they are in control, that they're thinking for themselves, that they're not brainwashed. And if you ask them to tell you about their past and their childhood, I wouldn't say 100% of the time, but I'd say 90% of the time, they'll tell you a story about how miserable they were growing up, or how they were beaten or tortured, or this happened or that happened, or they were a drug addict, or in so many cases, not all, but so many cases when one actually investigates, and certainly after the person leaves and reaccesses who they were before, and objectively looks at their claims, it was vastly confabulated, very distorted to the negative. And I can just speak for my personal experience. I was convinced I had a terrible childhood, and I was miserable, and I wanted to commit suicide, and that my father was physically violent. And when I got out of the group and I told my sisters this and my next door neighbor this, and by the way, my next door neighbor growing up introduced me for a talk that I gave at the Ethical Culture Society, and the videotape of that is on my website at freedomofmind.com. But she was like, "Are you kidding? Your father never hit you. You know, you were happy. We used to play all the time together. What are you talking about? You were miserable and suicidal. It's just like not true." And I was like, "It's not." And when I talked to my sisters, they were like, "Daddy never hit us." And I had a direct memory when I was 12 of him slapping my cheek once because I lied to him when he asked for where the change was for my lunch money, and I lied to him. And my sister said, "Yeah, he lost his temper. He slapped you once." It's like, and it took me a while to realize that I was in my cult identity. I was just living this nightmarish version of who I was before. That just wasn't real.
Cults can, or many actually do, encourage or foster a a past negative time perspective, even to the point of false memories.
Exactly. So, there was a kernel of truth. My father did slap me once, but I had generated in my mind this belief that that he was violent all the time, and he wasn't. And I think when I was 17 and my first love dumped me, I felt like, oh, what's the purpose of life? But I certainly wasn't suicidal. But I did feel really depressed. So there's a kernel of truth in that. But so what we refer to this as confabulation of taking, kernel and then just blowing it up. But I can tell you that I've done many cases over the decades of out and out false memory indoctrination where people were hypnotically influenced to believe that they were raped by father, mother, sister, brother, aunt, uncle, whatever, or raped by aliens or any number of other variations of this. And there was never any external corroboration of fact. And more likely, when we looked at when those beliefs started to be believed, we were able to often track it back to an agent of influence who was acting unethically, whether it was a cult group in a workshop session or someone who had taken a course in how to use covert hypnotic techniques, or someone who was just very suggestible watching a TV show where someone was talking about their in reality rape, and they empathized and came to believe through over and over and over remembering it that it actually had happened to them when it hadn't. Can I just add one more
Sure,
point?
go ahead.
So I definitely believe that there's such a thing as false memory implantation. On the other hand, there are people who take the exact opposite polar view and say that's impossible to recover memories of abuse years later. And I disagree with that. I do believe that trauma can happen and it gets blocked out of conscious memory and can be reactivated years later. So I believe both are possible, and it takes someone who's a very trained clinician to try to figure out what really did happen. And as a therapist, I always focus on the here and now and what symptoms the person's experiencing and try to alleviate their suffering in the here and now. And there used to be a belief that you had to remember everything that happened in your past, which is what Scientology is based on, or largely based on, in order to relive the trauma, in order to be free of the trauma. But trauma specialists for more than a decade, if not 2 decades, have realized that getting a person to remember a trauma is re-traumatizing them. And in fact, you don't need to relive a trauma. And in fact, you're not liberated from the trauma by reliving the trauma. And that there are better techniques for healing a traumatic experience. And thank you for letting me have the time to explain that.
Sure. I think you're speaking of the associated identity. It's recalling a trauma as the associated identity. In other words, the victim, rather than recalling it as a impartial observer, that would be a disassociated identity. Are you alluding to that?
Exactly. Right.
Okay.
So, for example, if someone is trying to, for whatever reason, remember what happened to them when they were younger, and I might add that cognitive memories start around 3 to 4 to 5 years of age. So when people say they're trying to remember what happened when they were 2 weeks old, it's already a suspicious memory. Or if they say, I'm trying to remember what happened in a past life, that's really a suspicious memory. But let's say, something traumatic happened and you were 10 years old. What you can do in a therapeutic situation is anchor the person in the here and now and have them look at a TV screen of their younger self and see what happened to their younger self. And in that way, they can recall details of whatever happened, but that it's not going to make them be traumatized again because they're in the here and now and they're safe. There's much more to this than, and it's a therapy technique, but I just want to really state very categorically that Hubbard's tech that all of auditing is based on, that you need to relive the trauma and get rid of the negative charge and relive it over and over and over again, and then look earlier in your life to find it and live it over and over and over again. It's just not a good way to help promote mental well-being and help people be functional. It's a great way to make people dependent for the rest of their lives on paying money and then go into their past lives forever and be indebted to Scientology.
I think that's Hubbard's rendition of Freudian paradigm, one of Freud's early psychoanalytic paradigms, which actually he did not use. He took up the free association paradigm rather than running things in incidents, earlier similar. I think that was one of his experimental ideas, but that's not what he used in his psychoanalytic techniques.
Mm-hmm. I'm not a Freudian, by the way, so I'm not going to comment. There are some people who are neo-Freudian and such, and some people that I respect, but it's not. I'm much more cognitive behavioral and much more eclectic. I really believe in just empowering people to be fully human, in charge of their own lives, their own thoughts, feelings, and live happy, productive lives.
Yeah, there have been actually a lot of discoveries and developments in the field of psychology and psychotherapy post-Freud that have effectively superseded and obsoleted Freud's paradigms.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
Would you like to take a break? We're going to take one for station identification if it's all right.
Mm-hmm.
Please stay with us. We'll be right back. And we're back. You're listening to The Edge. Our guest today is Steve Hassan. We've been discussing his book, Releasing the Bonds, Empowering People to Think for Themselves. Steve, I have some questions that, when I've read your book, I wonder if the authentic self, which is, I guess, could be described as the person's basic personality in a cult member, does the authentic self perceive and decide independently of a cult identity?
While the person's in the cult, you mean?
Yes.
So my thought on that and my experience on that is that when the cult identity is in charge, the authentic self is pretty suppressed. That doesn't mean there can't be moments where the real self kind of comes to the executive consciousness level, especially if the person is visiting back home or hearing an old song that has special associations or eating some food that has special associations. It can kind of activate the person's real self. And at that moment, there's a different neural operating system than the cult identity. And so at that, when that self is in the executive role, there may be a chance to doubt or question or fight back or something. But if the cult identity is very strong, it's going to go out of its way to suppress it as quickly as possible.
And cults, how do they beef up identities? Do they have any particular methods that they use to nail their recruits with identities that are more anchored or solid, more solid?
Well, I think that As I described in Releasing the Bonds, I think that part of the process is activating child parts of a individual's life, an idealistic part, or a part that looked to your parents as the ultimate authority figures, or a part that really did believe religiously. Or as I described, I grew up in the Cold War era where I was very much against